The bitter December wind cut through the darkness like a blade, carrying with it the promise of snow and the distant rumble of the midnight freight train. Cowboy pulled his weathered coat tighter around his shoulders as he guided his horse along the familiar path toward his isolated cabin on the outskirts of Millbrook. At 43, his face bore the lines of a man who had seen too much, lost too much, and learned to find solace only in solitude. The town of Millbrook lay behind him, its warm windows glowing like distant stars against the black canvas of night. Cowboy had ridden into town earlier that evening for supplies, enduring the usual suspicious glances and whispered conversations that followed him wherever he went. 3 years had passed since he'd arrived in this corner of Wyoming territory, and still the townspeople treated him like a ghost from their collective nightmares. He didn't blame them. A man who kept to himself, who spoke little and smiled less, naturally aroused suspicion in a tight-knit community where everyone knew everyone else's business. But Cowboy preferred it this way. The isolation protected him from forming attachments that could only lead to pain, and it protected others from the darkness that seemed to follow him like a shadow. The rhythmic clop of his horse's hooves on the frozen ground was suddenly interrupted by something that made his blood run cold, a child's scream, high and desperate, cutting through the night air like a knife through silk. Cowboy's head snapped up, his trained ears immediately pinpointing the direction of the sound. It came from the railroad tracks, less than half a mile to the east. Without hesitation, he spurred his horse toward the sound, his heart pounding with a mixture of dread and determination. As he crested a small hill, the scene that greeted him was something from his worst nightmares. There, illuminated by the pale moonlight, a small figure lay bound to the railroad tracks. The child, a boy who couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, was struggling frantically against the ropes that held him fast to the cold steel rails. The distant whistle of the approaching train echoed across the prairie, and Cowboy knew he had perhaps 3 minutes before the massive locomotive would thunder through this section of track. 3 minutes to save a life, or watch helplessly as an innocent child met a horrific fate. Cowboy leaped from his horse before the animal had fully stopped, his boots hitting the ground running. The boy's eyes, wide with terror, locked onto his as he approached. The child's mouth was gagged, but his muffled cries spoke volumes about his desperation and fear. "Easy, son," Cowboy said in his gravelly voice, dropping to his knees beside the tracks. "I'm here to help you." His weathered hands worked frantically at the ropes, which had been tied with the precision of someone who knew their knots. These weren't the hasty bindings of a panicked kidnapper, but the careful work of someone who had planned this horrific act down to the last detail. The realization sent a chill down Cowboy's spine that had nothing to do with the December cold. The train's whistle sounded again, closer now, and Cowboy could feel the faint vibration of the approaching locomotive through the rails. His knife flashed in the moonlight as he sawed through the thick rope around the boy's ankles. The child's eyes never left his face, and Cowboy could see a mixture of hope and terror warring in those young features. "Almost there, boy," he muttered, moving to the ropes around the child's wrists. "Just hold on." The ground began to shake more violently, and the beam of the train's headlight appeared in the distance like a malevolent eye. Cowboy's hands moved with practiced efficiency, years of working with rope and leather serving him well in this desperate moment. The final strand parted just as the train's whistle screamed its warning, now less than a quarter-mile away. Cowboy scooped the boy into his arms and dove away from the tracks, rolling down the small embankment as the massive freight train thundered past, its cars creating a wall of noise and wind that seemed to go on forever. When the last car finally passed and silence returned to the prairie, Cowboy found himself lying in the frozen grass, the trembling child clutched protectively against his chest. He gently removed the gag from the boy's mouth, expecting a flood of words, questions, or tears. Instead, the child remained silent, his dark eyes staring up at Cowboy with an expression that seemed far too old for his young face. The boy's clothes were expensive, a fine wool coat and polished boots that spoke of a wealthy family, but there was something else, something in the child's manner that suggested this wasn't a random act of violence. "Can you tell me your name, son?" Cowboy asked gently, helping the boy to his feet. The child opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, shaking his head. Whether from trauma or some other reason, the boy seemed unable or unwilling to speak. Cowboy studied the child's face in the moonlight, noting the fine features and well-groomed appearance. This was no street orphan or runaway. Someone in Millbrook would be missing this boy, and when they discovered what had happened, there would be questions. Questions that Cowboy wasn't sure he wanted to answer. As if summoned by his thoughts, the sound of approaching horses reached his ears. Torches flickered in the distance, and he could hear the voices of men calling out in the darkness. The search party had arrived, but as Cowboy looked down at the silent boy beside him, he couldn't shake the feeling that their rescue might have just begun a much more dangerous journey. The boy suddenly grabbed Cowboy's hand, his small fingers gripping with surprising strength. When Cowboy looked down, he saw the child shake his head frantically, his eyes wide with a fear that seemed to go beyond the trauma of his recent ordeal. The message was clear. The boy didn't want to be found by whoever was coming. Cowboy's instincts, honed by years of survival in a harsh and unforgiving world, screamed that something was very wrong with this entire situation. But as the voices grew closer and the torchlight began to illuminate the area around the tracks, he knew that the choices he made in the next few minutes would determine not only the boy's fate, but his own as well. The midnight train had passed, but Cowboy had the distinct feeling that the real danger was just beginning. The torchlight flickered across Cowboy's weathered face as Sheriff Marcus Brennan approached with a group of townsmen, their expressions a mixture of relief and suspicion. The boy remained pressed close to Cowboy's side, his small hand still gripping the cowboy's coat with desperate intensity. "Well, I'll be damned," Sheriff Brennan said, his voice carrying a note of surprise that didn't quite mask an underlying wariness. "Cowboy, what in the hell are you doing out here with young Timothy Ashford?" So the boy had a name, Timothy Ashford. Cowboy filed that information away as he studied the faces of the men surrounding them. Among them, he recognized Dr. Harrison Wells, the town's physician, and Mayor Edmund Ashford, whose expensive clothes and bearing immediately identified him as someone of importance. The family resemblance between the mayor and the boy was unmistakable. "Found him tied to the tracks," Cowboy replied simply, his voice carrying its usual gravelly tone. "Train was coming. Had to cut him loose. Mayor Ashford pushed forward, his face a mask of paternal concern, but Cowboy noticed something else in the man's eyes, something that looked almost like disappointment. "Timothy, thank God you're safe." The mayor reached for the boy, but Timothy shrank back against Cowboy, his grip tightening on the cowboy's coat. The reaction didn't go unnoticed by the assembled men, and Cowboy felt the shift in the atmosphere as surely as he would feel a change in the wind before a storm. "Now that's mighty strange," said Jake Morrison, the town's blacksmith and one of the more vocal members of the community. "Boy seems awful scared of his own father." Dr. Wells stepped forward, his medical bag in hand. "The child has been through a traumatic experience. It's not uncommon for victims to form attachments to their rescuers. Timothy, come here, son. Let me examine you." But Timothy remained pressed against Cowboy's side, his dark eyes darting between the assembled men with an expression that spoke of deep-seated fear rather than simple trauma. When Mayor Ashford tried again to approach, the boy actually whimpered and tried to hide behind Cowboy's larger frame. Sheriff Brennan's eyes narrowed as he studied the scene. "Cowboy, I'm going to need you to explain exactly what happened here tonight. Start from the beginning." Cowboy recounted the events in his typical sparse style, but even as he spoke, he could see the doubt growing in the sheriff's eyes. The story, while true, sounded implausible even to his own ears. A mysterious loner happening upon a child tied to railroad tracks just in time to save him? In a town where coincidences were viewed with suspicion, it was the kind of tale that invited more questions than answers. "So you just happened to be riding by at exactly the right moment?" Morrison's voice carried a heavy note of skepticism. "Mighty convenient, if you ask me." "Nobody asked you, Jake," Dr. Wells interjected, but his own expression suggested he shared some of the blacksmith's doubts. Mayor Ashford's face had grown pale in the torchlight. "Sheriff, I want to know who did this to my son. Someone tried to murder Timothy tonight, and I demand justice." "We'll get to the bottom of this, Mayor," Brennan assured him, but his eyes remained fixed on Cowboy. "But first, I need to understand why the boy seems so afraid of everyone except the man who found him." Cowboy felt Timothy's small hand slip into his, and when he looked down, he saw the boy mouth a single word: "Please." The desperation in those young eyes stirred something in Cowboy's chest that he had thought long dead. The protective instinct that had once driven him to stand between the innocent and those who would harm them. "The boy's been through hell," Cowboy said quietly. "Maybe he just needs time." "Time for what?" Morrison demanded. "Time for you to fill his head with lies? For all we know, you're the one who tied him to those tracks in the first place." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot, and Cowboy felt the familiar weight of suspicion settling on his shoulders like a mantle he had worn too many times before. He had saved the boy's life, but in a town where his reputation was already questionable, even heroic acts could be twisted into something sinister. "That's a serious accusation, Jake," Sheriff Brennan said, but his tone suggested he wasn't entirely dismissing the possibility. "Cowboy, I'm going to need you to come into town tomorrow for questioning. There are too many unanswered questions here." "I understand," Cowboy replied, though his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He had been through this before, in other towns, other times. The pattern was always the same: suspicion, accusations, and eventually the inevitable demand that he move on. Dr. Wells approached Timothy again, speaking in the gentle tones he reserved for frightened children. "Timothy, can you tell us what happened?" Who tied you to the tracks? The boy's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. He looked up at Cowboy with an expression of such profound trust that it nearly broke the cowboy's heart. Then Timothy shook his head and pointed to his throat, indicating that he couldn't speak. "He hasn't said a word since I found him," Cowboy confirmed. "Trauma, maybe. Or maybe he's been told not to talk," Morrison suggested darkly. "Maybe someone's threatened him." Mayor Ashford's face flushed with anger. "Are you suggesting that I would threaten my own son?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Morrison replied. "I'm just saying that something doesn't add up here. A mute boy, a convenient rescue, and a rescuer with no past that anyone can verify." The tension in the group was palpable, and Cowboy could feel the situation spiraling toward something dangerous. In his experience, when men were frightened and confused, they often looked for someone to blame, and he had always made an easy target. Timothy suddenly tugged on Cowboy's coat and pointed toward the tracks. When the adults followed his gesture, they could see something glinting in the moonlight, a piece of rope that had been cut away during the rescue. But there was something else. Something that made Sheriff Brennan's expression grow even more serious. "That's a professional knot," the sheriff observed, kneeling to examine the rope more closely. "Whoever did this knew what they were doing. This wasn't some random act of violence." The implication was clear. Timothy's near-death experience had been carefully planned by someone with knowledge and skill. But as the men absorbed this revelation, Cowboy noticed something that chilled him to the bone. Mayor Ashford's face had gone from pale to ashen, and his hands were trembling slightly as he stared at the rope. "We should get Timothy back to town," Dr. Wells said, breaking the tense silence. "He needs medical attention and a warm bed." But as the doctor reached for the boy, Timothy's reaction was immediate and violent. He screamed, the first sound he had made since Cowboy removed his gag, and clung to the cowboy with desperate strength. The sound echoed across the prairie like a gunshot, and in that moment, everyone present understood that this case was far more complicated than a simple kidnapping. The boy's terror was real, but it wasn't directed at his unknown attacker. It was focused on the very people who should have been his protectors. As the group began the journey back to Millbrook, Cowboy found himself walking beside Timothy, the boy's small hand firmly clasped in his own. Behind them, he could hear the whispered conversations of the other men, and he knew that by morning, the entire town would be buzzing with speculation about the mysterious rescue and the strange behavior of young Timothy Ashford. What Cowboy didn't know was that the real mystery was just beginning, and that the truth behind Timothy's ordeal would shake the very foundations of Millbrook's carefully constructed facade of respectability. The morning sun cast long shadows across Millbrook's main street as Cowboy made his way to the sheriff's office, Timothy walking silently beside him. The boy had refused to leave Cowboy's side since the rescue, and after a tense discussion with Mayor Ashford and Dr. Wells, it had been agreed that Timothy would stay with Cowboy temporarily, under the watchful eye of the law. The townspeople lined the wooden sidewalks, their faces a mixture of curiosity and suspicion as the unlikely pair passed by. Whispered conversations followed in their wake, and Cowboy could feel the weight of their speculation like a physical presence. He had lived this scenario before, in other towns, other times, but never with the life of a child hanging in the balance. Sheriff Brennan was waiting in his office, along with an unexpected visitor, a well-dressed man in his 50s with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. The stranger's expensive clothes and confident demeanor immediately marked him as an outsider, someone from the territorial capital or perhaps even back east. "Cowboy, this is Federal Marshal Robert Hayes," Sheriff Brennan said by way of introduction. He arrived on the morning train from Cheyenne. Marshal Hayes studied Cowboy with the calculating gaze of a man who had spent years reading people's secrets in their faces. "I understand you were involved in quite an incident last night, Mr. "Just Cowboy," came the gravelly reply. "And yes, I found the boy tied to the tracks." "Interesting timing," Hayes observed. "I came to Millbrook to investigate reports of unusual activity in the area. Railroad sabotage, missing persons, that sort of thing. And now I find a child nearly murdered in what appears to be a very professional operation." Timothy, who had been standing quietly beside Cowboy, suddenly gripped the cowboy's hand tighter. The boy's eyes were fixed on Marshal Hayes with an expression that Cowboy couldn't quite read. Not fear exactly, but something close to recognition. "Marshal Hayes has some questions about last night," Sheriff Brennan continued. "And frankly, so do I. The more I think about it, the more strange coincidences I see." Cowboy settled into a chair, keeping Timothy close beside him. "Ask your questions." Hayes pulled out a small notebook and flipped through several pages. "According to my information, you arrived in Millbrook approximately 3 years ago. No one seems to know where you came from or what brought you here. You keep to yourself. You have no visible means of support beyond odd jobs. And yet you live comfortably in that cabin of yours." "A man's past is his own business," Cowboy replied evenly. "Not when children start turning up tied to railroad tracks," Hayes shot back. "Not when those children seem terrified of their own families, but trust complete strangers." As if to emphasize the marshal's point, Timothy moved even closer to Cowboy, his small frame pressed against the cowboy's leg. The boy's behavior was becoming more puzzling by the hour, and Cowboy could see that it was raising more questions than it answered. Dr. Wells entered the office, his face grave. "I've completed my examination of Timothy. Physically, he's unharmed, but there are some concerning findings." "Such as?" Sheriff Brennan prompted. "The boy shows signs of prolonged stress and malnutrition, despite his expensive clothes and well-groomed appearance. More troubling, he has what appear to be old rope, burns on his wrists and ankles. This wasn't the first time he's been bound." The silence that followed this revelation was deafening. Cowboy felt Timothy's hand tremble in his own, and when he looked down, he saw tears streaming silently down the boy's face. Marshal Hayes leaned forward, his expression intense. "Doctor, are you suggesting that this child has been systematically abused?" "I'm suggesting that Timothy Ashford has been living in fear for some time," Dr. Wells replied carefully. "The question is, fear of whom?" Sheriff Brennan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Now hold on, Doc. Mayor Ashford is one of the most respected men in this town. He's been nothing but concerned for his son's welfare. Has he?" Cowboy's voice cut through the discussion like a blade. All eyes turned to him as he continued. "The boy won't go near his own father. He screams when anyone tries to take him away from me. And last night when the mayor reached for him, Timothy looked more afraid than he did when he was tied to those tracks." The implications of Cowboy's words hung heavy in the air. Marshal Hayes made several notes in his book before speaking again. "There's something else you all should know. I didn't come to Millbrook just to investigate railroad incidents. I'm here because of reports that this town has become a way station for a very particular kind of criminal enterprise." "What kind of enterprise?" Sheriff Brennan asked, though his tone suggested he might not want to hear the answer. Child trafficking, Hayes said bluntly. We've been tracking a network that operates throughout the territory, using respectable communities as cover for their activities. Children disappear from one place and turn up in another, usually sold to wealthy families who ask no questions about their origins. Cowboy felt Timothy's entire body go rigid beside him. The boy's breathing became rapid and shallow, and his grip on Cowboy's hand became almost painful in its intensity. You're suggesting that someone in Millbrook is involved in this network? Dr. Wells asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm suggesting that Timothy Ashford might not be Timothy Ashford at all, Hayes replied. I'm suggesting that the boy you all know as the mayor's son might actually be a victim of this trafficking ring, and that someone tried to kill him last night to keep him quiet. The revelation hit the room like a thunderbolt. Sheriff Brennan's face went pale, Dr. Wells dropped his medical bag, and Cowboy felt pieces of a horrible puzzle beginning to fall into place. That's impossible, Sheriff Brennan protested. The mayor's had that boy for years. I've seen them together countless times. Have you? Hayes challenged. Or have you seen a frightened child who's been trained to play a role? Think about it, Sheriff. When was the last time you heard Timothy speak? When was the last time you saw him playing with other children or acting like a normal boy his age? As if responding to the marshal's words, Timothy suddenly pulled away from Cowboy and ran to a corner of the office, where he crouched down and began rocking back and forth. The behavior was heartbreaking to witness, and it painted a picture of a child who had been living in a state of constant terror. Cowboy rose and approached Timothy slowly, speaking in the gentle tone he might use with a frightened animal. It's all right, son. You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you. Timothy looked up at him with eyes that held far too much pain for someone so young. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke his first words since the rescue. They said they would kill me if I ever told. The simple statement confirmed everyone's worst fears and opened up a Pandora's box of questions that would shake Millbrook to its very foundations. As Marshal Hayes began to outline his investigation, and Sheriff Brennan struggled to come to terms with the possibility that his town had been harboring a monstrous secret, Cowboy found himself wondering just how deep this conspiracy went and how many other children might be suffering in silence. But one thing was certain. Timothy had found his voice, and with it, the courage to expose the truth that powerful people had tried so hard to bury. The question now was whether that truth would set him free or put him in even greater danger. The revelation that Timothy might not be Mayor Ashford's biological son sent shockwaves through the sheriff's office, but it was only the beginning of a much larger and more horrifying truth. As Marshal Hayes continued his questioning and Timothy slowly began to open up, a picture emerged of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Millbrook's society. "Tell us about the other children, Timothy," Marshal Hayes said gently, kneeling down to the boy's level. "Can you remember any of them?" Timothy's voice was still barely above a whisper, but his words carried the weight of terrible knowledge. There were many. They came and went. Some were sold to families far away. Others, his voice trailed off, and he looked up at Cowboy for reassurance. "Others what, son?" Cowboy prompted, his own voice thick with emotion. "Others who tried to run away or tell someone. They disappeared. The man with the scar said they went to a place where they could never cause trouble again." Dr. Wells had gone pale during Timothy's testimony. "My God," he whispered. How long has this been going on? Marshal Hayes consulted his notes. Based on our investigation, we believe this network has been operating for at least 5 years. Millbrook was chosen specifically because of its isolation and the fact that certain key figures in the community could be persuaded to look the other way. Sheriff Brennan's hands were shaking as he poured himself a cup of coffee. You're talking about corruption at the highest levels. Mayor Ashford, the town council, and others, Hayes confirmed grimly. Timothy, can you tell us about the man with the scar? The one who was in charge? Timothy's description was chilling in its detail. A tall man with a jagged scar running from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, well-dressed but with cold, dead eyes. He spoke with an educated accent and carried himself like someone accustomed to command. Most disturbing of all, he seemed to take pleasure in the children's fear. He said I was getting too old, too difficult to control, Timothy continued, his voice growing stronger with each revelation. He said it was time for me to have an accident, but first he wanted to make an example of me, to show the other children what happened to those who caused trouble. Cowboy felt a cold rage building in his chest. Where are the other children now, Timothy? There's a house, the boy said, outside of town, near the old mine. It looks abandoned, but there are rooms underneath. That's where they keep us until we're sold. Marshal Hayes was already reaching for his coat. Sheriff, I'm going to need every available man you have. We're going to end this tonight. But as the lawmen prepared for their raid, Timothy grabbed Cowboy's arm with desperate urgency. You have to be careful, he whispered. The man with the scar, he's not working alone. There are people in town, important people who help him. They have guns, and they won't let the children go without a fight. The implications of Timothy's warning were clear. The rescue operation would be dangerous, and there was no guarantee that all the children would survive if the traffickers felt cornered. But as Cowboy looked into Timothy's eyes, he saw something that gave him hope. The boy was no longer the terrified, silent victim he had been just hours before. He was a survivor, and he was ready to help save others who were still trapped in the nightmare he had escaped. Timothy, Cowboy said quietly, I need you to tell me everything you can remember about that house. Every detail could save a life. For the next hour, Timothy provided a detailed description of the underground facility where the children were held. He drew rough maps of the layout, identified potential escape routes, and warned about the guards and their routines. His memory was remarkable, and it was clear that he had been planning his own escape for some time. As the sun began to set over Millbrook, a grim procession made its way toward the abandoned mine. Marshal Hayes led a team of federal agents who had arrived on the afternoon train, while Sheriff Brennan commanded a group of carefully selected local men, those who could be trusted to put the children's safety above any misguided loyalty to corrupt officials. Cowboy rode alongside them despite Hayes's initial protests. That boy trusts you more than anyone else, the marshal had finally admitted. If we're going to get those children out safely, we might need that trust. The abandoned mine sat in a valley about 5 miles from town, its entrance boarded up and overgrown with weeds. But as Timothy had described, there were signs of recent activity for those who knew what to look for: fresh tire tracks, discarded cigarettes, and the faint glow of light from what appeared to be ventilation shafts. The raid itself was swift and decisive. The traffickers, caught off guard by the coordinated assault, offered little resistance. But the scene that greeted the rescuers in the underground chambers was something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. 12 children, ranging in age from 6 to 14, were found in various states of physical and emotional distress. Some had been there for months, others for years. All bore the psychological scars of prolonged abuse and terror. But they were alive, and as word spread that they were being rescued, hope began to replace fear in their young faces. The man with the scar, identified as Vincent Carver, a former Army officer turned criminal entrepreneur, was found in a hidden office, frantically burning documents. His arrest revealed the full scope of the operation, including a ledger that contained the names of buyers, sellers, and corrupt officials throughout the territory. But perhaps the most shocking revelation came when Mayor Ashford himself arrived at the mine, ostensibly to assist with the rescue operation. Timothy's reaction was immediate and violent. He screamed and tried to hide behind Cowboy, pointing at the mayor with a trembling finger. "He's one of them!" Timothy cried. "He's the one who bought me! He's the one who said I had to pretend to be his son!" The mayor's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, denial, and finally, resignation. As Marshal Hayes placed him under arrest, Ashford's carefully constructed facade finally crumbled. "You don't understand," he said desperately. "My real son died of fever 3 years ago. My wife was devastated. I thought if I could give her another child to love, it would heal her broken heart. I never meant for anyone to get hurt." "But you knew where Timothy came from," Hayes said coldly. "You knew he was stolen from his real family." Ashford's silence was answer enough. As the rescued children were loaded into wagons for the journey back to town, Cowboy found himself walking beside Timothy once again. The boy's ordeal was far from over. There would be months of healing, both physical and emotional, and the difficult process of reuniting him with his real family, if they could be found. "What happens now?" Timothy asked, his voice still small but no longer filled with the terror that had characterized it for so long. "Now you get to be a child again," Cowboy replied. "You get to play and laugh and not be afraid anymore." Timothy was quiet for a moment, then looked up at Cowboy with an expression of profound gratitude. "Will you stay? At least until I'm not scared anymore?" Cowboy felt something shift in his chest, a wall that had been built around his heart beginning to crumble. For 3 years he had lived in isolation, convinced that he was better off alone, that caring for others only led to pain. But this brave young boy had shown him that sometimes the greatest courage came not from walking away, but from choosing to stay and fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. "I'll stay as long as you need me to," Cowboy promised, and for the first time in years, he meant it. As the wagon train made its way back to Millbrook under the stars, the rescued children huddled together, finally safe from the nightmare that had consumed their young lives. Behind them, the abandoned mine stood empty, its dark secrets finally brought into the light. The town of Millbrook would never be the same. The corruption that had allowed such evil to flourish would be rooted out, and new leadership would emerge to guide the community toward a better future. But perhaps most importantly, 12 children who had been lost to the darkness had found their way back to the light, thanks to the courage of one man who had chosen to listen to a child's cry in the night. Cowboy had come to Millbrook seeking solitude, but he had found something far more valuable: the chance to make a difference, to protect the innocent, and to discover that even the most broken hearts could learn to love again. As Timothy's small hand slipped into his own, Cowboy realized that his days of running from his past were finally over. He had found his purpose, and more importantly, he had found his family. The silent night that had begun with terror had ended with hope, and as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, it illuminated not just a new day, but a new beginning for everyone whose lives had been touched by the courage of a lonely cowboy and a brave young boy who refused to give up. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much and come back often.